It's great to see a full house for Oriana. So I'd like to welcome all of you for the 34th Kuznets Lecture, which is going to be given by Oriana Bandiera. I also have to say that this talk is being live streamed and recorded, so live stream viewers will be encouraged to ask questions, and that by attending in person, you've agreed to have your comments recorded and filmed and shown publicly. So the annual Simon Kuznets Lecture honors the legacy of Simon Kuznets, whose pioneering work on growth and development had much to say about labor, which Oriana will talk about today. Kuznets was never at Yale, but together with many collaborators decided that Yale was the place to have a center devoted to the quantitative study of economics. And in 1961, EGC was arguably one of the first centers in a US institution that looked at these issues. And right from the start, a very important part of EGC was international collaborations. One of its first programs was to host several Latin American economists who had to leave Latin America because of a set of revolutions and were given home here at EGC. EGC also played a role in supporting, for instance, economists who, when Bangladesh was formed, had to leave those areas and came and spent some time here. In 1975, as the Ford Foundation reviewed its initial investment in EGC, it's described its support as part of a broader mission to advance the economic well-being of people everywhere. And in terms of the US foreign policy, it explicitly stated that its aim was to go beyond the water's edge. Today, as we know, many countries are pulling back from their commitment to international development. And we are seeing that a lot of vital research and humanitarian programs are losing this funding, and the poorest areas will pay the price. As international development engagement diminishes, I think at EGC we all remain committed to try to ensure that this work continues and to the best of our ability to support it. And I think this commitment is also embodied by this year's speaker, Oriana, who has been involved both in Europe and internationally in supporting international development work and partnerships in some of the poorest parts of the world. She's the Sir Anthony Atkinson Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, where she directs the Hub for Equal Representation. Among her many honors, she is an honorary foreign member of the American Economic Association, a fellow of the British Academy and the Econometric Society, a recipient of an honorary degree from University of Munich, and winner of the Esther Bostrup Award and the Arrow Award. Oriana's work is a great fit for the Kuznets series, which was actually set to mark the 10 monographs that Kuznets published in the 1960s on the quantitative aspects of the economic growth of nations, which is actually the title of the series. I just want to quote from his second monograph, which I think epitomizes this work. To put it simply, the major source of international differences in country output per worker between developed and underdeveloped countries is not that the full-time labor forces of the former and of the latter are distributed differently among the several industrial sectors that can be reasonably distinguished. It is rather that within each sector proper, within agriculture, within mining, within manufacturing, within transportation and trade, etc., the product per worker in the underdeveloped countries is so much lower than that of the developed. And so I think roughly half a century after Kuznets wrote this, we're delighted to have Oriana talk about this issue. So welcome, Oriana.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roini, for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for the hospitality. So let's get going. There are basically two sides to economic development, and normally we see only one of the two. There is the micro side, and there is the macro side. So the micro side focuses on the people, the macro side focuses on the nations, but the main argument for studying development remains the same, which is that most of the people in the world live in low-income countries. It was 2/3 when Kuznets wrote his Nobel Lecture, is now 85%. Reading, these are two beautiful quotes, at least so I think because I chose them. I particularly like Kuznets' hope. One might hope, but with limited expectations, that the task of refining analysis and measurement in the rich countries will not be pursued to the neglect of badly needed studies for the least developed. So in this lecture, I will show how the organizations of labor links the productivity of individuals to that of their countries. Right? I will begin by showing evidence on poverty traps. And I will show how poverty traps keep people at subsistence. If you are a subsistence, you consume everything that you produce, so there is no room for growth whatsoever. That's quite simple. And then I will show 3 changes that occur with the organization of labor over the course of development, from subsistence to small entrepreneurship or self-employment, then to firms and larger organizations, and how across this process the job variety increases. Okay? Overall, the analysis is rooted and provides evidence for multiple equilibria driven by either indivisibilities or coordination failures. So, Kuznets wrote, one might hope, with limited expectations, that this situation will be resolved. That is, that there will be more studies on low-income countries. Now I'm showing you 2 graphs. The very colorful graph comes from Carden de la Vigna study of publications in top 5. It ends in 2010. Development is the turquoise at the very top with a helpful red arrow touching it. And because 2010 is a long time ago, especially in publication time, on the right-hand side, I also have CEPR and MBR working papers from a recent paper that Imran is writing on race. And you see, no matter where you look in the timeline, the share of papers on economic development has remained quite flat. In the meantime, the population share living in low-income countries has gone up to 85%. Okay. I think the material that we present today builds 2 links. One is a bridge between micro and macro development, because if choices of people are interdependent, if the payoff of my action depends on what you're doing, then we cannot understand individual decisions without taking into account the macro context. So many of our randomized controlled trials, if run at the individual level, will fail to capture the interdependence of choice. And I will give some examples later. I will also, hopefully, build a bridge between the study of high and low-income countries. Okay? Because if they are outcomes, 2 different outcomes of the same process, then we want to know what goes on in low-income countries, because it can tell us something about the way high-income countries work. So this shouldn't be seen as 2 rival fields of studies, rather a complement one to the other. Hey. Now, all of this is drawn on work with my very brilliant and extremely patient co-authors, many of whom are in this room, and who put up with me and all the delays that that entails. And papers are there, so you'll see. So I begin with poverty traps. Okay. Strange that it didn't look like that on my screen, but these are the papers that cover this question. Okay, so fundamentally, there are 2 views of poverty. Imagine that these diagrams represent people. Okay? So you have assets, productive assets at time t on the horizontal axis, and productive assets at time t plus 1 on the vertical axis. It's a standard steady state diagram where you see how capital at time t plus 1 how capital at time t gets transformed into capital at time t plus 1. And the point where that touches the 45-degree line will be the steady state. So if the world looks like that, which is the Warresian, perfectly competitive markets world, the only way that you can explain poverty is by people having immutable traits that are different. That is, there will be 2 curves, one that intersects the line at a low k, and one that intersects the line at a high k. The alternative explanation, and these, of course, are 2 extreme views. The alternative explanation is that everybody faces exactly the same production function, but the production function exhibits non-convexities, right? And in particular, it's extremely steep at the beginning. So in this world, productivity differences can be due to differences in initial wealth. This is the world where you can have poverty traps, because if you're born with an endowment which is smaller than K star, you're always going to fall back. Sorry, with an endowment which is smaller than K star, you're always going to fall back to 0. If you're born with an endowment which is bigger than K star, you're going to converge to the high equilibrium, K double star. So how do we present evidence from this in practice? We look at the evaluation of Brack's UPG, which is Ultra Poor Graduation Program, a very long 18 years panel. I don't know what happened to my, okay. There was a very big block that said 2024, because the data from the 17th year round of the survey has just come in. And for those of you who will be here tomorrow, Munchi will present some of the first results with this double cohort data that we have now. Okay? But for these results, we don't need those data because we didn't have them when we wrote the paper. So in this data, basically, these are households in Bangladesh. We ran a census in 2007. We ran a survey based on the census, always in 2007. And then 50% randomly selected areas get the program in 2007. And the remaining 50% get it in 2013. Now, this is the simplest possible setting that you can imagine. There are only 3 jobs that are available. So the beneficiaries of these programs are always women. So I'm always going to be talking about women because those are the ones that receive the transfers. There is basically 3 jobs that they do. They can be casual laborers in agriculture. Whenever there is need to weed a field, the landowner hires them. They have no idea when that's going to be, how long it's going to last. It's just casual labor. Similarly, casual labor in domestic help, maids, or raising livestock. Now, rearing livestock is a more regular job, and it pays more. Right? So on the left-hand side graph, we have the share of these 3 jobs in different areas. So each of the lines represents a geographical area. And on the right-hand side graph, we have the distribution of these jobs by social class. So starting from the richest people in the villages, they only do livestock rearing. And they will never be seen close to a field weeding. The middle classes almost exclusively do livestock rearing. And then if you go all the way down to the ultra poor, almost none of them does livestock rearing. Okay. Now, not surprisingly, if you look at the distribution of productive assets, you get a bimodal distribution, because those who do livestock rearing own livestock. Okay. So we get a bimodal distribution with a mass at 0, or close to 0, and a mass. These are log takas. Now, sometimes one has to admit that good luck strikes. And the good luck in this case was the fact that the transfer that the program gave was just enough to move the beneficiaries from the low mode all the way to the point of lowest density. This is lucky because if there is an unstable equilibrium, it will be there. By definition, the equilibrium is unstable, so there'll be no people at that level. This also illustrates the difficulty of identifying poverty traps with observational data, because the size of this transfer was almost the same as 1 year worth of per capita consumption. And shocks of that size very rarely happen. So we never see people jumping from the low equilibrium to the point of lowest density. So once we have this luck, we can estimate the transition equation. And there are two estimates. The wriggly one is done with a non-parametric estimator, and the smooth one is a cubic fitting. And you see that they both cross the 45-degree line 3 times, which gives us 2 stable steady states, and in the middle, 1 unstable one. Then we can verify, using the data after 2011, that the people who are brought to the right of the unstable steady state grow, and those who are to the left go back to their original equilibrium. This is productive assets. They even buy some land. And this is the average gap in consumption. Now here, for those of you who are eagle-eyed, there is something quite interesting. That is, the diff in diff at the beginning is negative. That is, people who will escape the trap have lower consumption than those that will not escape it. And I see somebody nodding. It is intuitive because those who are very close to the threshold would rather save instead of consuming so that they can overcome the threshold. This is quite important for policy evaluation, and I'll come back to it later. Now, the setting is also useful in the following way. We can calibrate a very simple occupational choice model to quantify the loss due to the misallocation of this labor. This requires observing the returns of the same person doing both jobs. And normally we don't observe this because people only do the job that is better for them. But in this case, we do have it, because before the program, they had no choice. They had no way of getting a cow. So they only had to do casual jobs. And after the program, the condition for getting the cow was that they tried at least for 2 years. Okay? And so that shuts down the endogenous selection, because we observe everybody with and without the cow. And that gives us an estimate of the returns. The returns are positive for everybody, but not everybody is born to be a master cow rearer. Okay? You see that there is a huge level of dispersion. This person here should probably own all the cows in the village and run a massive cow rearing business. This person here, as soon as there is a job which is slightly better than casual labor in agriculture, will take it. And this is, in general, a theme that is not quite appreciated enough, because the moment we talk about people we know are heterogeneous, but workers, for some reason, become an homogeneous input. Now, this comes to the point of the talk where people would ask, legitimately, what's the external validity of this? You know, we find it in a set of villages in Bangladesh, 3,000, 6,000 people, fine. But how common are even the characteristics of this context? Okay. So this is what pushed me some 5 years ago to put together what I call the Jobs of the World database. This is freely available on that website, and is sponsored by FCDO and IZA. Okay, and what we do is that we harmonize the DHS and IPUMs. The reason this is advantageous is that for most low-income countries, we don't have IPUMs. And DHS is available for most of those countries for which we don't have IPUMs. So that means that if we combine the two sources, we can cover most of the world. The DHS is a survey, most people will know, is a survey for maternal health and fertility, but has a very detailed labor module, or at least detailed enough that we can get the basics. Okay. So using the data, we can first check whether this bimodality is a quirky thing of the villages where UPG was implemented, or whether it happens everywhere. So these are countries that, this is Bangladesh, the entire of Bangladesh, not just our villages. India, what are they? One is, this is cut. One is Afghanistan and the other one is Pakistan. Okay? And you see that there are bimodalities everywhere. The second thing is subsistence jobs, that is jobs that pay no earnings or are very irregular, like the ones that the women in Bangladesh were doing, are very common in the poorest countries. And especially so among the poorest. So one cool thing about both the census and the DHS is that we have measures of assets. So we can aggregate these measures of assets to build measures of wealth. We use the first principal component, which and actually for those countries for which we have both surveys, we can see that it matches quite well. And this allows us to look at occupational choice by wealth. In all these graphs where you see gradation of the same color, the lighter color is always the richest people. So this is the share of people engaged in subsistence work, and you see that is much higher for the poorest quantile. Okay? Now, aggregating these findings, there is an obvious link between the poverty rate and the overall performance of the country, because more people you have in the poverty trap, the more people there are who cannot save and cannot grow, cannot invest. So the link is pretty obvious. Just more people cannot accumulate, the lower the productivity of the country. The policy implications sometimes can be surprisingly hard to carry through. So the first is that we should think of poverty elimination as an investment. One criticism, the sole criticism of the ultra-poor program is that it's very expensive. But we should not value it according to some abstract reference point, but rather on the effect that this has. You know, if we calculate the return on investment for the individual households, it's very high. If you sum to that the aggregate benefits, it would be probably the best investment you can ever make. Okay? Small transfers only increase consumption in the short run. Okay? Actually, if we did a small exercise, we collected all the data that we could find on cash transfers and similar graduation programs. And I put like the average propensity to consume on the vertical axis, and the transfer rescaled by PCE, so household consumption, on the horizontal axis. And what you see is that the smaller the transfer, the more likely it is that it gets eaten within 2 years. But the problem here is that because we use consumption to measure poverty, it looks like giving people small transfers is a better way to reduce poverty, which is completely nonsensical, but comes down from the fact that the consumption is a good measure only in steady state. If you're changing between states, there is saving that you have to take into account. And if you don't do that, it's, well, you get a very misleading result. The other issue is the importance of targeting. If you have poverty traps, giving, say that the threshold is at x, giving x minus epsilon will have zero effect. It's a complete waste of x minus epsilon, whatever unit you have. Okay? So transfers might look regressive because for a given amount of available funds, it would be best to target the people who are closer to the threshold. Here is an illustration, and this is also very problematic for the scaling up of these programs, because normally we evaluate them implemented by the organization that created them, who knows the context well, and who knows who to target. So here is an exercise that we did with another BRAC program. It's a vocational training program called Prosper. And we thought to implement it at scale, so to actually help more people signing up for it. We did increase the signing up rate, so we trained many more people. The BRAC were trained with their selection, but all this training was wasted because the people didn't benefit. Okay? Once we go and compare our selection to the people the BRAC would select, you see that they would select younger men from richer households who are more educated and have no children, which at face value say, okay, this is supposed to be a poverty reduction program. What are you doing choosing this? Well, those are the only people who benefit, because you cannot benefit from a vocational training program if you don't have any education to start with. Okay? So that is the final lesson to learn from this part of poverty traps. And now move to the next stage of the organization of labor, which is firms. Okay? One striking feature of the jobs data is that if you plot the share of people who are in wage employment as opposed to self-employment, this increases very steeply with GDP. Okay? In the poorest country, most people are self-employed. They're entrepreneurs. Billions of entrepreneurs you have. And it also holds within country over time and historically in the US. Anders, who might not be here, Anders Jensen, has his job market paper shows that. Okay. Now, this process of organizational transformation, which is actually mentioned by Kuznets and then is forgotten, it occurs in addition to the well-known structural transformation. So if you look in every sector, if you look within agriculture, you see this fall in self-employment and increase in wage work. So it's not driven by the structural transformation. Interestingly, if you look now by wealth levels, you see that these wage jobs are taken first by the richer households, and then by the next rich and the next rich and so on. So this gives you an organizational view of the Kuznets curve, because it increases inequality at the beginning and then decreases as everybody converges to wage work. Now, we can look at whether there are multiple equilibria in the organization of labor using exactly the same technique as I used before. So we look, there is a bimodality. So this is a cross-section of country at the beginning of the data period in 2000. And you see that you have a bunch of countries with 2% and another 20% and another group at 90%. These are share of people with a wage job. If you estimate the transition equation, you get something very similar to what we saw in the poverty traps. It's actually even smoother. This is on a 10-year period, because both the DHS and the census data are every 10 years. Why is this interesting? There is a policy puzzle, which I think everybody knows, which is that there are loads of policies designed and loads of millions of dollars spent in measures that try to make small entrepreneurs grow. And this is the belief that small entrepreneurs are constrained. And so everything has been tried. Business training, accounting services, subsidies for hiring workers, management consulting, all sorts of things. There are many evaluations and many millions of dollars spent in evaluating these programs, to the point that now there are many meta-analyses, even meta-analysis of meta-analysis. And the effect is zero, no matter how you look at it. Now, if there are complementarities, the explanation is quite obvious, because removing barriers for a small number of firms cannot change their optimal size, because that depends on how many other firms are there. So you cannot treat 100 entrepreneurs, give them, a cash transfer or whatever form of training and hope that they grow, because they need a market to sell the stuff to. So if there are no other firms paying wages, this is the Rosenstein-Rodan idea. Okay. Now, I want to talk about what size means. Why is that in higher income countries we have organizations of larger size? What do we gain? And what do we lose? So in a firm of size 1, I mean, from an agency point of view, it's heaven. You have all the autonomy. You don't have any moral hazard because you own the firm. And because you're alone, you don't have to worry about hiring and firing people. Of course, the logic for the big firms is economies of scale, is specialization by comparative advantage, and it's the fact that managers can coordinate. But are we getting the sizes right? Because we only measure the number of people in an organization. Large organizations vary a lot in how much freedom or autonomy they give to their workers. And at the limit, there are some organizations that actually look like a collection of self-employed. This happens both by contracts and de facto. Now, if we think about it, we can measure the contracts. The second one is much harder. This is what Bob calls, I don't know if Bob is here, Bob Gibbons, he calls it the conversation we have on Sunday evening before starting to work on Monday morning. These are like unspoken rules that are much harder to detect. Let me give you an example of both. A while ago, Andrea and I came with the idea to analyze procurement and the effect of giving autonomy to procurement officers. This was in Italy back in the day. And we found this document, which is the US military specification for chocolate chip cookies and brownies, chocolate covered. This document is wonderful. It goes into details which you would never imagine somebody could dream of, because it prescribes exactly the size of the almonds that can go in a chocolate chip cookie, or the size of the almonds that can go in a brownie. And of course, these two are different. Yeah. So you can read these 26 pages of descriptions like this. This is the exact opposite. This is Netflix reimbursement policy. Just, act in Netflix's best interest, which is do whatever you would do if the money were yours. So there is quite a spectrum of differences contractually between an organization which is very controlling and one that leaves freedom. Now, the de facto ones are much harder. So I went to look at my contract from the LSE. I had never seen it, so that tells you how much. And there's some striking thing. Of course, I tell you the ones that make me look good, even that this is recorded. So I'm paid to work 35 hours per week. At first, I thought that was during the holidays. But no, actually, I'm supposed to work 5 hours a day. It puts my life in a completely different light. And I have 25 days of vacation, plus 5 days, plus 3 extra days, plus 8 days. Basically, I could go on holiday now. That's not what I work, as you can imagine. What I'm not showing you is all the number of forms that I have to fill in order to do anything. For instance, to come here to give this lecture, I should have filled the form 2 weeks in advance, get it approved. And well, as you can imagine, that only in this circumstance didn't happen. So what this tells us is that what does it mean to have an organization is quite fluid. Going past the examples, here is some real evidence. These are papers by these groups of people. Vittorio was a co-author, he's a co-author of mine with Tommaso Porci and others. What they do is that they collect very detailed time use data and time devoted to different tasks in manufacturing firms in Uganda. Okay? And what they show is that many firms, which are proper firms, actually behave like a collection of self-employed individuals. Okay? There is a very low level of specialization. There is no central figure that does the allocation of people to jobs, because all the jobs are more or less the same, and there is no strategy to be followed. On the other hand, so the firms are actually much smaller than they look if you just look at employment. On the other hand, similar firms, when they are self-employed people, can actually come together to share machinery. So the argument that you need a firm to exploit the increasing returns to scale due to fixed costs doesn't hold here. There is a rental market that perfectly substitutes for that. So that is to say that when we think of the transformation of organizations in terms of going from self-employment to large organizations, something that seems so strikingly different is actually quite fluid. The border is quite fluid. The third major transformation is an increase in job variety. What do I mean by that? I'll show you this pretty graph. These are a subset of the country in the data set. The different colors represent different ISCO 1 sectors. So green is agriculture. The countries here are ordered by GDP, from the poorest to the richest. And if you see little lines within colors, that means they're different jobs. So you see that going from poor to rich, you get a lot more combination of colors. So you get more jobs. And within each type of job, you get more varieties too. Okay? So this is something that when we first saw it, we thought that there was a mistake in the code. That there couldn't be 15 jobs in Mozambique. There surely had to be more. So really they weren't using the same code book. But it actually is like that. And it makes sense because there can be a two-way link here too, that firms use technologies and management practices that allow for a more granular division of labor. But conversely, more specialized job can increase productivity by facilitating training and allowing better matches. And that is a key theme, I think, when it comes to the difference in productivity across countries that links the productivity of individuals to that of their country, is how people are matched. So let me tell you something about that. A while ago, we asked ourselves, what on earth do CEOs do? I mean, we all know about CEOs, but what do they do with their time? Again, with Andrea and Raffaella and Steven Hansen. So we collected this diary data to understand what CEOs do and why they matter. This was an enormous labor of love because we shadowed the calendar for a week and we basically collected information on every activity, every 15 minutes, what the CEO was doing during that week. Then we used some sophisticated machine learning or a simple clustering analysis that give more or less the same message. And that gives us two types of CEOs, which are very different from one from the other, and which might be best for some types of firm. So to test that, we found a way of building a parsimonious index from survey questions which correlates to the 1,000 CEOs every 15 minutes for 6 days data collection. And this allows us to scale the measurement of CEO style to 42 countries. This is the EBRD World Bank Enterprise Survey. We have 4,500 firms in it. And we scale up the measurement to all of these. And we look at whether the mismatch between the CEO type and the firm type reduces productivity. And true enough, that's what we find. Okay? This is the labor productivity of the firm. If you call mismatch when you have so the two types of CEOs are leaders and managers. When you have a leader but need a manager, and vice versa, when you have a manager but need a leader, productivity is about 18% lower. And it comes from both sides. So there is not one type of CEO that's best for everybody. There are some firms that need managers and some firms that need leaders. And if you get the wrong one, you get lower productivity. Now, the theme of matching people in style or by skills to the jobs that require that style of skills is a very important one. And there is a lot of a very firm belief that in low-income countries, frictions such as nepotism or corruption can interfere with the process. So in a paper that Ilse will present tomorrow, we try to quantify the importance of different factors in explaining the differences in the quality of matching across countries. Right. So, can I have a sense of the time? Okay. Now, I knew that I would get to the point where I had to make a choice. The choice is that I speak very quick. So, now, new work, new problems. Motivating workers has always been the main challenge of organizations. Typically, we pay people for performance, but this becomes harder and harder to do as firms grow, because linking the action of one person to the actual performance becomes harder and harder. These are two papers with my serial co-author Nav Ashraf and others, where we look at two initiatives from two different firms, one in the manufacturing sector and one in the banking sector, to try and motivate workers in very different ways. Let me start with the first one. So, okay, this is a very condensated version of the paper. I want you to look at this line. This is a frontier. This is the participation constraint, basically, for entry-level white-collar workers. And we plot pay plus bonus on the vertical or the horizontal axis, and a measure of meaning, which you have to take my word for it, is based on very well-tested psychological scales on the vertical axis. So what this is telling you is that people who don't care about their job need more money to do it. You're selling your soul, you sell it for a price. That's basically the thing. And that is the problem with incentives, that you can make people do what you think is good for the firm, but you cannot make them like the job. If they dislike it regardless how much you pay them. They will stay because they'll stay for the money. And the reason that matters is that you cannot contract on absolutely everything. You saw the US Army attempt at contracting on the size of the almonds in a chocolate chip cookie. That probably doesn't work too well, especially for people who are, managers and white-collar workers. So this intervention that the firm tries to do actually flips the logic of incentives on their head. Instead of telling people, do what the firm wants you to do, it makes people think what it is that gives them meaning in life. This seems completely fluff, but there is some logic to it and some well-established psychoanalysis and psychological theory behind it. But essentially, the intervention makes people think about the process through which they go when they do things at work, and whether that process is compatible with what they like doing. Now, it turns out that for many people it isn't. And who are these people? These are the people who had very low meaning and were staying in for the money. So a lot of these people quit the firm. And that, of course, increases profits because these were well-paid, low-productivity workers. There are three channels. The low performers leave the firm. Within the firm, those who do not leave, they change jobs, some of them, or increase effort in the same job. This one is a more standard initiative. These are basically banks paying their employees to take time off to go do charitable activities. It's a very complex randomization strategy where we stratify many different levels to calculate peer effects within the immediate team, within the office, within the branch, and so on. So I don't have time to go into the details. But the interesting finding in this paper is that the intervention is actually clashes with the standard incentives, and more so for people at the top of the hierarchy, because an admin assistant can take a day off and come back the next day, and the job will be there the same. But a manager who takes a day off the following day will have double the amount of work to catch up. And so what we see is that typically this program reduces the performance of top managers who are less likely to participate. And that unravels because the employees see that the manager do not participate, and they basically get demotivated as well. So this is an attempt at creating a common culture around the pro-social activity, which backfires because it's not designed to be compatible with the other incentives. Okay. The last thing that I want to talk about is gender norms. And the reason I put it at the end is not because it's the least important, but because it's something that affects countries across the development spectrum. Okay? A byproduct of the transition from subsistence to market and then from market to firms is that gender starts shaping the allocation of labor. Quite trivially, if everybody is doing the same work, if everybody is cultivating the family plot, you cannot have gender differences because there are no different jobs to give to men and women. But the moment people start being self-employed and selling whatever it is that they produce on the market, it is the men typically that go selling and the women stay at home. And because work in the home is not counted as an economic activity, this is the way the SNI do it, we see a drop in participation in the labor force. Actually, that's the standard U-shaped relationship between women labor force participation and GDP. And that comes almost entirely from the fall in unpaid labor. So the decreasing part of the U comes from that. Now, what's the implication of this for productivity? Of course, we have to keep in mind that although the national accounts do not give any value to the work that women do inside the home, this is work that gets done. Okay? So all the estimates of increasing GDP if labor force participation of women increases are based on the erroneous assumption that the value of the women's work is zero in the home. So they're probably much overstated on that dimension. But there is still gains to be had if eliminating these differences between women and men in terms of work inside and outside the home contributes to better matches. Okay? Because you might have many women who are staying at home who are great engineers, so you would have better bridges and better railways if they were allowed to work, and many men also would be better cooks. So that is just simple reshuffling. Now, there are two ways that we go and look at this problem. Maybe I only speak about the first one, given the time constraint. In order to understand why this is happening, we have to see which side of the market it's coming from. Is it the firms that don't want to hire women? Is it the women who are not inclined to work? Or is it just a norm that sustains itself? Okay. Here, we look at the same employer. This is a multinational firm that operates in 100 countries, and it's exactly the same firm. We look at exactly the same jobs, offering the same contracts for the same qualifications. Okay? And then we use the female labor force participation when the people enter the job market to proxy for gender norms. So this gives us variation both within countries, because women who enter the job market at different points in time will have faced different pools, and across countries. Now, this is the gender pay gap. When it's positive, it means that women are earning more than men for the same job. Normally, that line is always negative. What we see here is that women who entered the labor force when there were very few women in the labor force, once they enter the firm, they have much higher wages than men. So that speaks to the positive selection into the labor force. Then we have other measures, like whether they are in the top decile of wages, then they're more likely to be promoted to managers. And on every single measure, we see that there is this correlation. So this speaks to the potential gains from reallocating women from the work inside the home to firms. Now, the question which remains, if you read, Becker has a paper about this. He says, well, the multinationals should exploit this, right? Because there is all these women who are clearly more qualified and more productive. The multinational doesn't care about the norm, so why don't they just hire mostly women? Well, we calibrate the parameters of the pay policy, and we show that hiring more women would increase productivity and profit, but it would increase the level of gender inequality to a level that is probably unacceptable. Okay? So the equilibrium becomes self-sustained because there are few women in the workplace. If you hire more, it would become evident that they're earning more than the man, and that would be politically unfeasible. Okay. The final paper that I want to discuss quickly is about the education puzzle. So by education puzzle, I refer to the fact that one of the leading explanations for low labor force participation by women was the fact that women had less education. So in many countries, the education gap is now closed. However, the labor force participation gaps are unchanged. We collaborate with two large universities in Punjab, Pakistan, and we survey two full graduating cohorts. The first part of this work is probably the most boring thing that you could possibly read, because we go through all the possible explanations that the literature has put forward. Women have higher reservation wages, women would like to work closer to home, women would like private transport to the site, women would like part-time jobs. Anything you can think of, we ask, and we find no difference whatsoever. Right? So these are all the things, a subset of the things that we ask. But there is one thing that predicts whether women are employed after having graduated the same way as men. And that is whether they apply early, whether they apply for the job as soon as they graduate. If they apply right away, they are, I think it's 17 percentage points more likely to have a job after 6 months. So we try to understand why that's the case. And so we ran an experiment where we provided small incentives for women to apply early. That reduces the employment gap by 30%. And this effect remains 14 months later. We do check all the expectations about wages, duration of time for search, and so on. And there is no bias there. But there is one source of bias, which is expected age and marriage. Women who expect to marry late, who are over-optimistic about the time that they have to find a job, apply later, and end up not being able to work. Okay? So the treatment effect is much larger for those who, in the absence of the incentive, would have applied much later, because they expect somehow they're optimistic about their ability to marry later than the median. Okay. So let me conclude. I think all of this put together raises more questions than provide answers, and that was intentional because there's so many of my students here, and I never gave them questions while they were students, but I thought I would, in gratitude for them being here, I thought I'd put on the table questions which I think would be interesting to answer. Definitely, there is a question about the missing middle. We really need evidence of why and how organizations come together and how and whether they change. It's not clear to me, for instance, that the arrangements that we see in Uganda, this collection of self-employed people sharing machinery, is not the past, but is the future of what will happen in the US, in the UK. We're already seeing a huge rise in solo self-employment at the bottom of the skill distribution. Definitely, we need better measurement and data collection. Time use is really the way to go, I think, because anything else that we collect don't tell us what we don't know. Okay? By asking people what they do with their time, we don't need to pre-specify what they could be doing with their time. And now with AI, there is also the possibility of doing qualitative interviews at scale. I think one of the main drawbacks that we suffer from when we do analysis of development is that all our data comes from surveys that we create. But we can only ask about things that we know because we don't know what we don't know. And hopefully, we would be able to do qualitative work at a much larger scale. Okay? And with complementarities, scale matters a lot. So we have analysis of individuals and a lot of policies randomized at the individual level, which the answer on their effectiveness would be very different if we were to randomize them at the level at which they matter, which is perhaps the level of the market. Okay? So I leave you with this, and thank you so much for being here.
More about sort of what you're thinking there. Why should we expect ever fortunes to reverse?
So, well, because it's happened before. Yeah. that is the cheap, and lazy answer. But I think there is a tendency. I mean, we've seen post-pandemic the increase in working from home, and people do not want to return to the workplace. I think there's a lot of malcontent about working in offices. And so if self-employment represents a viable alternative, I think we might observe a return to self-employment. And the issue is that if we believe that there are complementarities, what is individually rational is not the same as what's society rational. So each person individually might be better off working from home or being self-employed, but if enough people choose to do that, the whole organization system will unravel. Whether that's a good or a bad thing depends on how well the technology can make up for the lack of coordination in the workplace. But it's a completely open question, I think.
Hi, Oriana. I have a basic question on your point about the possibility of reshuffling or reallocation for high-skilled women to work, men go to the house. What do you think is the state of the evidence on, that reshuffling also entails that the children will be taken care of by other people, not by the mom? And so there is a mismatch, maybe the best match for the child would be the mom. Is that true? What is the state of the evidence there? If you're thinking about long-run child development as something that's important for familial workforce participation.
No, absolutely. So I think that debate focuses too much on the first. I have to repeat the question. Sorry. So the question was, if we allow or indeed encourage women to join the labor force after having children, won't that hurt the children? What evidence do we have about the outcomes of the children raised by their mothers or not? So I think that, if you think of the lifespan of an individual adult, the time where you exclusively had to take care of a child is very short. Right? Children stay children for, if you're an Italian mom, 40 years, but otherwise, I think after the age of 5, they go to school, right? So I think the problem there is not to get women out of the house as soon as they have the baby, but rather to find a way of valuing the skills that they learn during that period when they stay at home. Because currently, you could be unemployed playing with the PlayStation all day or taking care of 3 small children in a household. For the labor market, you look identical. You've been long-term unemployed for all those many years. And for all that I like playing video games, I think that managing a household gives you more skills that are currently not measured. So I don't think the solution is to get women to go to work as soon as they give birth if they don't want, but to put a value on their contribution to the housework.
So I'm interested in what you said about CEOs and leadership versus management. And I'm thinking, what's in your mind, what's the difference? And I saw these pro-social activities, and I thought of Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase using profanity to bring workers and saying you can't do remote work anymore. And I thought, well, maybe he needs some pro-social activities. Therefore, he must be a manager, not a leader. What's the difference in your mind?
Yes.
Leader in a management and the CEO role?
Excellent. So the question is, what is the difference between leaders and managers as CEOs? And I'm sorry that I didn't make it precise while I was presenting. So that difference is not a difference that we impose on the data, but rather it's a difference that comes out of the data through the machine learning. That is, we have a model where we assume that there are 2 styles, and then we let the machine learning classify people in these 2 styles, and then we look at the characteristics of what they do. So managers are people who are much more involved in the day-to-day running of the firm. They go onto the shop floor, they talk through the hierarchy. So they can talk to line directors as they can talk to the CEO or CFO. Leaders are more strategic. They only talk to the top group, and they do a lot more outside activities. So it's really a style of running the firm. One is hands-on, and the other one is very decentralized.
I guess where we started off was this broad framing of development as like one view being more based in micro, one view being more based in the macro, and the talks organized through that framing. And I know one thing you mentioned is that we can see them as so distinct. I was curious if you have any guidance for researchers on how they can do a better job of bridging those gaps, whether that's more in methods or more on some other area.
So definitely it's a matter of looking beyond the individual, so collecting data on organizations. Ideally, having interventions at the level of organizations, but we can learn a lot from observational data as well. So I think it's to look more at a higher level, but not at the highest level. Okay? Look in the middle, basically.
Thanks. So you talked a lot about the importance of complementarities and ways of systems interacting, and I'm wondering, your work is a lot on private sector organization, but what's the role sort of government coordination or public policy to facilitate some of these complementarities coming into existence?
That is a very good question, and indeed, in my first version of the slides, and this must be version, oh yes, I'm so sorry. So the question is, we're focusing on the private sector, but in presence of complementarities and any form of externalities, we do need coordination by governments. And I've never mentioned the government in any of these. In version 22 of the slides, this must be version 135, I had a whole section on the government. It is of the utmost importance to provide coordination, but that's typically not what governments do to a large extent. I think if we recognize that scale matters, any policy that brings firms together. So we're looking at the development of Korea, for instance, obviously South Korea. In 1970, South Korea was as poor as Ethiopia. It's really hard to imagine that, right, nowadays. So things can change very quickly, which is a prediction of the multiple equilibrium model, that once you go past the tipping point, you grow very, very fast. And the government, the policy, industrial policy of South Korea was that of putting like firms with like. So allowing coordination and exploiting positive shocks. In economics, we talk a lot about negative shocks, how to insure against negative shocks. We never talk about positive shocks. What do we do when a positive shock comes about? How can we be ready to ride the positive shock? So that is, I think, what the government should help.
So if I look at your first experiment, some sense it's all about liquidity constraints. Then you talk about the firm, and so on. So at that point, don't we want to talk a little bit about labor market regulation and other factors that kind of promote effective informality and this kind of very, very small firms. In some sense, I understand how much the regulatory framework is one of the big obstacles to going beyond where we are now in medical countries.
So the question is about the regulatory framework and maybe broadly the institutional setting and whether that can be a help or a hindrance to the process of development. And I think, of course, it's super important, but fundamentally it is endogenous, it is a choice. And we've seen examples of institutions being brought from a place where they work to a place where they have no effect. Like lots of the British institutions transplanted to India have no effect because in the end, what's de jure and de facto are two very different things. So I think it's the reason why I didn't go that way is because I was trying to do kind of in reduced form, the exercise of thinking institutions will be adopted in the way that endogenously is the best. But of course, if you have some form of complementarities and increasing returns in institutions, they might outlive the reason they were put there in the first place. And so that might be detrimental, definitely.